Let's talk about semicolons and colons today. All right, so colons and semicolons are two types of non-end stop punctuation. That means that you cannot put them at the end of a sentence like you would a period or an exclamation mark or a question mark. So it's similar to like a comma and a dash in that the sentence continues after use of the semicolon and colon. Let's start with semicolons. Most people think these are easier to use because there's fewer ways to use them. But I do want to point out that still a lot of people misuse semicolons. And probably the most common issue is that people try to use the semicolon like a comma when they cannot. So semicolons can be used two ways. The first way is like a period. So if you have two full sentences, instead of having a period between them, you could use a semicolon in some cases. This is the most common use for semicolons that I see. And then the second way that you can use a semicolon is in a list. And that is if you're separating items in a list that has three or more items, and at least one of the items in the list already has a comma within it, then you need to change the commas separating the items to semicolons so that it's clear where items end on the list versus commas separating information within items. This is less common, but it's also less avoidable. If you want to avoid using a semicolon, you can choose not to use the first case. The second case, you would have to rewrite the structure of the list or change the information you're providing in order to avoid using it in a list that already includes a comma. All right, so the rules for semicolons functioning like periods is that you have to have it two full sentences, at least two independent clauses in the sentence, and you have to put a full sentence or an independent clause on either side of the semicolon. So you have one full sentence, semicolon, another full sentence. And the clauses on either side of the semicolon must be very closely related on the same focus, detail, or thought. Otherwise, you're not allowed to combine them into one sentence. So for example, if you have a detail about a dog, semicolon, another sentence that provides a detail about the same dog or similar dog, those can share a sentence. And for semicolons, you lowercase the first word after the semicolon unless it is a capitalized proper noun or pronoun. So for example, the name Tina, the first person pronoun I, names of cities like Shakopee, names of places like St. Cloud State University, those are capitalized. But otherwise, if you have the word the, or you have the word where, or whatever, it's going to be lowercase because consider it is part of the same sentence and you're not capitalizing it just because it's the first word of the sentence. And note that you do not need to use a semicolon if you do not want to. In this kind of situation, you could choose a different sentence structure. For example, just using a period between the two independent clauses and separating them into two separate sentences, using a conjunctive adverb, and period using subordinating conjunction and turning one of the clauses into a dependent clause. Lots of different ways to avoid using it. So I would only use it if you really feel like it's appropriate and it's not going to distract the reader. And I will let you know, semicolons do distract the reader when they are used incorrectly. So here are some examples of semicolons when they're functioning like where a period would be. So for example, the resource nurse started her shift in the ICU. You could have a period there, that's a full sentence. You have another sentence about her shift, however, she ended it in the OR. We're talking about the same shift, same nurse, two short sentences, so you can combine them into one sentence using the semicolon. The patient asked too many questions. Tina finally paged the doctor. So again, full sentence on either side, but note you could also use a different sentence construction to avoid using the semicolon. You could use a comma and a coordinating conjunction like so in order to better show that one thing caused the other, but this is an option. The first day on the job is the hardest. I got lost 3 times on my first day. So again, both sentences are talking about the first day and difficulties, so, ascribed with that. Semicolon in the list. At least one item in the list must already have a comma in it for you to be required to use a semicolon instead of using commas to separate items in the list. There must be at least 3 items in the list, right? Which is like the criteria to make a list. If there's 2 or fewer and you're not using commas to separate items anyway, then you don't need to use commas or semicolons. The list must follow the rules of parallelism, like all lists do, so they need to have the same grammatical structure. They still need to include the fanboys coordinating conjunction between the last 2 items on the list, which is usually the word and. So even though there's a semicolon, you still put the word and before the last item in the list. And lowercase the first word after the semicolon unless it is a capitalized proper noun or the first person pronoun I. So here are some examples. This would be an example of an error where you're putting commas within items in the list and between, and you can see how it would be confusing to the reader. So I have traveled to Denver, Colorado, Paris, France, and Brisbane, Australia. And so a person could rightfully take from this the idea that you've been to 6 places instead of 3, when in reality you are listing a city and a state. So what it should look like is you should have Denver, comma, Colorado, semicolon, Paris, comma, France, semicolon, and Brisbane, comma, Australia. And so that clarifies to the reader that you are talking about 3 places and that you're talking about the city and the state for each one of those. Another example of incorrect formatting is if you have a comma between these multiple items on this list. So the patient ordered shiny, comma, ripe apples, comma, sweet, comma, juicy grapes, comma, melon, comma, and firm pears, and I have no idea what's going on, right? So in reality, what's going on here is that there are 2 adjectives preceding a noun, and the adjectives aren't cumulative, so you have a comma between those adjectives with 2 of the items in the list here, the apples and the grapes. So what you would need to do is say shiny, comma, ripe apples, semicolon, sweet, comma, juicy grapes, semicolon, melon, semicolon, and firm pears. The other alternative for this one is to put an and between the 2 adjectives instead of a comma. So if you said shiny and ripe apples, you could then use commas. Shiny and ripe apples, comma, sweet and juicy grapes, comma, melon, comma, and firm pears. So again, the issue is how many items on the list are we talking about? Are we talking about 6 items or are we talking about 4 items? All right, so moving on to colons, which are the 2 dots. The colon rules for using them in a sentence. The material preceding the colon must be an independent or complete sentence, independent clause. Don't use a colon after phrases like such as, including, especially, for example, and similar phrases. Those are the most commonly incorrectly used phrases with colons, at least in my experience. So to give you an example, a lot of people would want to put a colon in this sentence, but you should not. There are many options for receiving medical attention, comma, such as clinic visits, urgent care, and emergency department visits. However, the phrase such as is introducing the list, so you do not use a colon there. And to give you an idea, this part, if you just look at this part here and it does not create a full sentence, that's a signal that you're not supposed to use it, right? So cutting it off right here, there are many options for receiving medical attention, such as, then you know that you can't put a colon there. So again, no colon. And finally, you may choose to capitalize or lowercase the first word after the colon, unless it's a proper noun. So really, unlike the semicolon where you're supposed to lowercase it, you get the choice here if you're going to capitalize it or lowercase it. However, be consistent throughout your entire document. So whatever you choose to do, if you have to do this multiple times, make sure that you are doing it consistently every time. And I actually had to look back at some of my own writing to see what I tend to do, because I couldn't think about it offhand. I was like, I don't know, what do I do? So I looked back at some writing, and I typically capitalize the first word, whether or not it's a proper noun. Typically capitalize it after the colon. So here are some examples. You could introduce a list. So again, you have one full sentence here, and then you're introducing a list of items. The doctor asked for essential procedure materials: gauze, tweezers, a scalpel, and saline. And you can use a colon here because you do not have the phrase such as, or including, or for example, etc. You just have one independent clause and then your items in the list. Using in a positive to name something: I've only ever wanted to be a nurse in 2 areas, period. That could be it. That's all you have to say. But if you want to name what 2 areas you're talking about, OBGYN and neurology, you can do that with a colon. However, note you can also do it with a comma. So this is something in a positive, you can use a comma or a colon to name the thing that you mentioned. Introducing a quote. So if you're using a quote in your paper and your instructor says don't use a drop quote, which means that you just drop the quote in by itself as a full sentence on its own, there are different ways that you can incorporate the quote into a sentence and introduce it. One way to do that is to have a full sentence and then a colon and then the quote. So for example, John F. Kennedy often used antiquated sentence structure to make profound statements. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And so the quote needs to be like an example of what you were talking about, or show some kind of connection to the previous sentence. It can't be just a random sentence and then a quote that are not related. And then the last option here, you can do this to explain, illustrate, paraphrase, summarize, and or expand on the first sentence. So this is kind of like everything else. So if you want to make a statement and you want to explain it, you can do colon, explain it. If you want to summarize it, you can make a statement, colon, summarize it in different words, etc. So the example here, it's good if the ER makes you wait, period. But if you want to explain what you mean by that, because it's like, no, the natural instinct here is that it's never good to wait, right, when you need medical attention. But in this situation, it means that you're not dying, right? So if you can wait, it means that you are not dying and you can wait, and somebody else needs the attention first or more, right? So you can use a colon to explain that. It's good if the ER makes you wait, colon, it means you are not dying. Note that you could also use the word because here, and that would ring a little bit clearer in most people's ears. Is good if the ER makes you wait because it means you are not dying. So again, just because you can use them these ways doesn't mean you have to find creative ways to use colons in your sentences. Other ways that we use colons by convention is between a title and a subtitle. So notice the title goes first, colon, subtitle. And if you're citing something in a paper, usually you include both the title and the subtitle, even if the subtitle is like 30 words long. The next example here, between hours and minutes, right? So military time or standard time, we put colon in between them. Military time does not. Ratio and proportions. So if you're saying 6 to 1, so there are 6 patients to every 1 nurse, for example, you could say 2 in between them, TO, or you can use a colon. And the colon would be read in this case. If someone were reading it out loud, they would read it as 6 to 1. You can use it as a salutation in a letter. So again, you could use a comma here also, but a colon is viewed as a little more formal when you're saying, Dear Mr. Davis, or just Mr. Davis, colon, and then you start your letter or email, as we're in the tech days these days. And introducing a bullet point list. This is really common for technical writing, not as common in essay writing, and in fact, some instructors do not like seeing bullet point lists in essays, period. So use that with caution. But technical writing, which is writing for the workplace, for and about business and industry, you're actually encouraged to use bullet point lists because they're easier to read than a full sentence or a full paragraph that's written out, right? So you would have the list lead in. In this case, it's identifying the following as types of plagiarism, and then you would have your colon, and then in this case, your types of plagiarism set up as a bullet point list. All right, well, thank you for listening.